History and geography are messy. Human beings doing this and that, going here and there, and making the world turn through a combination of notable and unremarkable decisions and actions that add up to a complex web of causality that we attempt to contextualize, narrativize, and commodify even into a process or product we call history. Defining places by their physical characteristics or cultural practices also requires categorizations and simplifications. Conveniently, myself, my guests, and very likely you, the listener, happen to live in a place where the categories of culture, geographic area, and general historical trends all fairly neatly overlap, perhaps making these categorizations and contextualizations more natural. The Ozarks, through no small influence of its notoriously rugged landscape, are something that can be both qualified and quantified with some effort, though it should be noted that attempts to do so may end in the exchange of fighting words. Today we are joined, once again, by someone well-versed in this tricky dance, one of the all-time great chroniclers of our region, and an authority on the subjects of the history and culture of the Ozarks, Dr. Brooks Blevins. Dr. Blevins is the Noel Boyd Professor of Ozark Studies at the History Department at Missouri State University and is author of a number of books on the region, including the much-lauded 3-volume A History of the Ozarks. On top of his teaching and writing credits, he is no stranger to the audio medium, serving as a guest on many a podcast and radio show, and now hosting his own podcast on Ozarks history, The Old Ozarks, a humorous deep dive into the history, culture, and peculiar linguistics of the region he and his family have called home for generations. I'm Patrick Needham, and this is Talking History. Dr. Blevins, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Patrick.
I thought we'd talk first a little bit about your new audio endeavor, the Old Ozarks, a podcast available anywhere you find podcasts. You'll find it in the Ozark podcast feed. Tell us a little bit about the structure of how this podcast works.
Yeah, it's about a 20-minute every other week podcast that is scripted. So I write it and read it, basically. If you like being read to, then you should like this podcast, and it's over pretty quickly. I always start off with what I call the short sweetening, which is something to do with the Ozark dialect, linguistics, some kind of pronunciation tick or some odd word or something like that, and I'll usually delve into the history of that. And then something related will be what I call the long sweetening, which is the topic of the day, the topic of the podcast. And that's generally some kind of history topic. And I just kind of jump around. Part of what I envisioned for this podcast was a place where I could tell stories that I haven't gotten to tell in other places. And I've got a lot of those stories. I've spent a lot of years doing research, and so there's a lot of fodder out there.
Yeah, that's something that immediately stood out to me about the podcast, was that these are pretty succinct stories that would be difficult to put into a larger narrative about the region, like in your large-scale history books, the history of the Ozarks, but they are quite entertaining and illuminating about this area and about the history of this area and the type of people that lived here. Could you talk a little bit more about the short sweetening, about how to talk Ozark? I know that you incorporate that to some degree into your Ozark Studies classes, talking about the very peculiar Ozark dialect. Could you talk a little bit about what makes the Ozark dialect in its fading glory, I guess, like so unique?
Yeah, well, I don't know that a linguist would refer to it as unique, but you'd probably have to lump the Appalachian dialect in with it and maybe come up with like an Upland South dialect that would be pretty unique, even if kin to other U.S. dialects in a lot of ways. But there are a few things that cause dialects to stick around. Poverty, the rural nature of a region. If you're talking about regional dialects, rural area, poverty, low levels of formal education. And if you've got 3 boxes to check at home. You can check all three of those boxes when you're talking about the Ozarks. Sure. Yeah. So that we've kept a dialect longer than a lot of people keep noticeable dialects because of that. And so what you get into, you've got your lexicon, your vocabulary, you got odd words that have survived in our dialect that have probably died out in most other English dialects around the planet. You've got strange ways of pronouncing things. Mm-hmm. That's probably the thing that most people recognize first off when they talk to anybody.
Sure,
is
your warsh.
Yeah, your. However, and a lot of times it's how you butcher your vowel sounds, mm-hmm. or how you change those vowel sounds from standard English to something almost unrecognizable, and so we do a ton of that kind of stuff. And then you've got some odd grammatical features that survive in whether you're using multiple helping words when one would be fine, or you're doing something that linguists call a-prefixing, the deer come a-running and a-jumping down the road, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. A lot of those grammatical things survive better than the other stuff, and we're not always conscious of it, especially if we're at home around family. If you're a native of the Ozarks, you're at home, or wherever you're from, whatever your dialect is, those grammatical things are going to come out when you're very relaxed around family, or when you're mad or something, mm-hmm. When it's kind of an unconscious spew of language that comes out, that's when we'll drop those little dialectical things, and we may not even be conscious of it.
To that end, do you consciously employ some of this language in your speech? Like, say, when you're at home in northern Arkansas and you have a visitor on the farm, do you turn up the Arky?
I don't necessarily do it in that context, but I will say that I do consciously maintain parts of the dialect that I like, and my kids would tell you the same thing. For instance, I've used the term poke for years.
For like a bag? Or
for a bag or sack, especially a paper poke. When I was a kid, that's probably the only word my grandparents ever used for the kind of sack you would bring home groceries in, or something like that. It was a poke. And my wife and kids would, I think, sometimes get aggravated at me for insisting on calling sacks a poke. But it was part of it was they know what a poke is. Uh-huh. I mean, they may not use the word as often as I do, but that's one of those words that has largely disappeared from Ozark dialect, which was very much in the center of Ozark dialect, 50 or 75 years ago. So it's things like that, saying I knowed or I growed okra in the garden this summer. Some of those butchering the English language in the peculiar ways that we do. Mm-hmm. I still use a lot of those terms, and I think anybody can relate to this. You don't have to be from the Ozarks or Appalachia. You can be from anywhere, because we've all got some kind of a dialect. It may not be as noticeable and as distinct as a rural Ozarks dialect, but I think a lot of people can relate to the practice of code switching, mm-hmm. of talking one way at home or with your family at Thanksgiving, and then talking a completely different way when you're out at work, wherever that is, because you need to sound like you know something.
Absolutely.
When you're out there. And we all do that, I think, to a certain degree, or at least most people do. I'm sure there are people who grow up in an atmosphere of just standard English, bang, 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 all the time. I've never been around households that do that, but I'm sure there are people out there who do that. But for the rest of us, we code switch, and a lot of that it's for, I'd say, economic and cultural reasons. Mm-hmm. We want a good job, and sometimes you have to sound a certain way if you're going to work yourself into that good job and you kind of work up the ladder. We don't want to sound like an imbecile. like a yokel, and we'll kind of change things that way. And I know I sound different today than I would have 40 years ago when I was a teenager. But as time is going on, and as I've become more comfortable, and when I don't really have to worry about job security or going up the ladder or anything like that, I've become much more comfortable with reincorporating a lot of that Ozark dialect into my own speech. And so a lot of times when I'm giving talks to the public, I'll throw in an okrie or a poke or something like that, because I'm what I get, who cares what I get to lose.
It's one of the few contexts in which sounding like an Ozarker probably increases your credibility.
Right. Yeah, I mean it's like a college football coach sounding like with a deep Southern accent. I mean
just fits.
That's an advantage.
Exactly.
A pilot who sounds like Chuck Yeager. That's that used to be the thing, and all pilots end up sounding like that. So I've become more comfortable with doing that. And on the podcast, a lot of times I will use that kind of language, and sometimes in print. In my trilogy, A History of the Ozarks, one of the words I insisted on using, or the spellings and pronunciations I insisted on using in that book, is holler, as in way down in the holler, or you got a still in the holler, that kind of stuff, instead of holla or hollow,
right?
Because that's how we say it in the rural Ozarks, and it just seems so weird to say holla or hollow. And so anytime you see me use that word that would normally be holla, HOLLOW, in the book, it's HOLLER. It's always spelled that way, and because that's how we say it.
It makes sense, because if you are reading a book about the Ozarks and you keep saying in your head hollow, you're not getting a very good idea about the Ozarks.
Right. Yeah, and that was kind of editorially, that's probably the most noticeable thing that I did. I didn't write okrie instead of okra, or sody pop and instead of soda, that kind of stuff.
You didn't participate in the great Ozarks literature tradition of tortured dialect writing.
Let's keep away from that as much as we can.
Well, what I think is interesting and really liked about the short sweetening and have liked about engaging in your courses here at Missouri State has been the linguistics and dialectical stuff, because in part because of those economic pressures that you've talked about, in part because of migration and just a general universal cultural flattening in this country over the last 50 or so years, that you're not as likely to naturally encounter this stuff in the wild. And it's English and it's largely slang, but it is almost because it is so tied to the culture here, it's almost approaching like a dead language type situation, where you're one of those last few people who are out here trying to keep these words in circulation and these grammatical rules that don't seem like rules in play. And I just think that's interesting and worthwhile. What drives you to do that?
For anyone who's interested in this topic, Ozarks dialect, and especially the lexicon, the vocabulary of the old Ozarks, if you want to call it that, probably the best book out there specifically about the Ozarks is a book that Vance Randolph co-wrote back in the 1950s called Down in the Holler. And in Down in the Holler, there's this huge vocabulary list at the end of the book. And I remember the first time I got a hold of a copy of the book and started going through it. And I grew up in the rural Ozarks. I was born in 1969, grew up in the 70s and 80s in a very rural place on the farm that my grandparents still lived on. My grandparents were both born in 1914 and surrounded by their siblings, my great uncles and aunts on their farms, and some of them who were born as far back as like the mid 1890s. And so I grew up immersed in what you would call a real kind of old timey Ozark dialect. But as I got to looking through Randolph's vocabulary of words that he had collected when he first moved to the Ozarks right after World War I, so in the 1920s and
previous,
30s, right? That probably half of them I had no idea what they were, and I mean this was just 100 years ago that people were using these terms pretty regularly. Now Randolph was a rascal, and I wouldn't put it past him to throw in a ringer or two just to make up a word.
Imaginative
or two.
Man.
yeah, because we know that he took liberties with other things that were supposed to be nonfiction, but I think most of that it's just a reflection of how quickly language changes, how quickly dialects on the margins of a dominant, standard language group, whatever language group that happens to be, we're talking about English, how quickly that stuff disappears and gets marginalized, and after a few generations, nobody remembers any of that stuff.
Because it's entirely oral. Other than encountering things like Shepherd of the Hills or something where you have, like, again, tortuously written dialect, you're not likely to ever really encounter the way that people talk in a day-to-day kind of context versus the way that they write and record their official deeds.
That's right. If you go back and look at like newspapers, say from the late 19th century, which is about as early as you're going to find really good newspaper coverage anywhere in the rural Ozarks, most of the time that's written in standard English.
Yeah,
you're not going to get you're not going to get dialect in newspaper stories all that often. Though I will say, recently there's just an example of a word that kind of disappears and just is almost plumb disappeared today. In my family, we have a word called Cairo, and if you Cairo, it's to cause a loud fuss about something.
Okay.
Or if a lot of times in my family, it was usually used like my dad was a bird hunter, and so he usually had some bird dogs. And if the dogs were barking about something late at night, and nobody knew what was going on outside, they were Cairoing. What's the dogs Cairoing about? And I've asked, I don't know how many people from backgrounds in the rural Ozarks, and almost no one has ever heard of this word. Almost no one that I've talked to grew up in a family where people and dogs and mules or whatever Cairo. And you can even physically Cairo if you're causing a ruckus. So I started, with the magic of modern technology and newspapers.com and Google searches and all this kind of stuff. I started looking for that earlier this year, thinking it cannot be something that one of my ancestors invented and nobody else has ever heard about this. It doesn't show up much, but if you go back and look like early 20th century, 19th century newspapers, it pops up 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
And it's always in the South, and it's always the same in the same meaning group. I mean, it's the same word. So it was out there, and it was used at one time because we've got print proof of it. But it's just that word has just disappeared.
Yeah.
It's just almost disappeared. And so that's another one that I've tried to preserve and pass on, and I'm not doing a very good job of it yet.
So let's talk a little bit about long sweetening and historical storytelling, narrative making. I'm assuming you have, just considering the volumes that you have written about the Ozarks and the amount of research that you have done over the years, you just have a pile of stories like this that you got a poke full of stories poke full of yarns that you're pulling out one at a time and sharing with us. What draws you to one of these kind of short and sweet narratives, and like, how do you choose what to put into the show?
Yeah. Well, you're exactly right, Patrick. I literally have a pile of these at home. I've got what I call my writing shed. It's it's a little freestanding building out behind my house where I do most of my stuff. And when I was working on that trilogy, I had so much research material that I eventually printed it all off and put it in 3-ring binders, just these huge, I broke binders. You know, I had so much weight in these things. And so I've got probably about a dozen of these big binders on a shelf in my shed. And one of them is just kind of devoted to stuff that didn't really fit anywhere in my books. And so I've got this big stack of stories on just interesting characters, interesting people from the Ozarks. And I usually start there. If I'm trying to think of something, I'll just thumb through my interesting characters list. The only trouble with that is that a lot of times that will require a little more research to fill out a long sweetening to really get enough of a story. But it's a really good place to start with. In that same folder, I've got research about like holiday traditions, all of this Christmas stuff. My last podcast this year before Christmas will be a Christmas in the Ozarks, sort of 19th century Ozarks Christmas stuff. What will surprise you about how people celebrated or more likely didn't celebrate in the 19th century. Halloween stories, sports stories, hunting and fishing stories, wildlife stories, you know, all this kind of stuff that really never had a good landing place in a more traditional book. And so you're exactly right. That's where I start, is with that stack of kind of ready-made topics, and then I'll just go with something. It might be seasonal. It might just be, like next month, or actually this month, like in mid-month, my podcast will be on a baseball topic.
Yeah.
And it's World Series, postseason play time. And I love baseball. So any excuse to talk about baseball stories,
sure.
I have to make sure that the whole podcast doesn't become
a
baseball podcast, because there are already some of those. And the world probably doesn't need any more of them. But I try to keep it as fun as possible, but, it can't always be fun.
Right.
And some, you still got things you need to talk about that are more serious and less easy to joke about.
Well, I'd say you do kind of thread that needle pretty well. Like it's humorous through every episode, but it's not humorous throughout the entirety of the episode. It's compelling in more than just being a funny way, and it's funny in more than a just point at the Ozarks and laughing kind of way, which is of course how a lot of people have experienced the Ozarks over the years,
right.
Culturally speaking. So I guess my final question is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit, and I've been eager to hear writers' input. But history is so it's like I said in the intro, it's messy. Like it spills everywhere, across time, across physical places. It's difficult to draw bounds on it, and so it's difficult to know where a narrative begins and ends and what's contained within the bounds of that narrative. And so, like, how do you go about determining this might be interesting, but it's actually not really germane, and I probably shouldn't throw it in here, or it's interesting enough that I do throw it in here? Like, how do those things end up not in a History of the Ozarks Volume 1, but they end up in your show instead? Like, how do you draw the bounds on those stories and decide when they're worth the energy to tell?
Yeah, that's a tough thing to do, that kind of self-editing. And I would say that my first rule is, if it's interesting to me, it's fair game, because at this point in my career, I'm basically just entertaining myself.
Sure.
And then and it's a nice plus if somebody else enjoys it. But I'm not podcasting for a living, so I guess that's a nice thing to just be able to do what you want to do, and if somebody likes it, that's great. So that's my first rule. If it's interesting to me, and I realize that there's a lot of stuff that's interesting to me that will put people to sleep immediately. Yeah. I love agricultural history, but you got to do that in small doses. Yeah. You talk about too many too many shocks of wheat, then that's that's a major turnoff to people for some reason. I don't understand why that is. But a lot of it is I'm a firm believer in, and I was doing this a long time before I was podcasting or anything like that. I'm a firm believer in reading out loud. And so when I get a draft, I've always done this from the first book I did back in the 90s until now. I always read it out loud. And that's even more important if you're doing like an audio thing. I mean, it's got to sound right. It's got to sound like something that people would be interested in. And so I've edited out a lot of stuff just in the process of reading it out loud and thinking, that's probably not going to translate really well. That's probably better for the page than it is for the ear. And so that's another thing that I go through. And then part of it's just a time constraint. You try to hold these things to a certain time limit, and that's why a lot of those stories got cut out of books.
Sure.
We tried to make those 3 volumes in the trilogy roughly the same length, and as a result, I probably cut 80,000, 90,000 words out of that trilogy at some point. And so I do the same thing, and editing is a really good thing. It's a difficult thing, but it's a really good thing because it really tightens things up. And if you go through something several times and cut, the loose ends off of it and those, fluffy edges, you're always going to have a better project or a product. And that's the process that I go through. And hopefully, by the end of it, there's going to be something that will interest somebody, will keep them engaged for 20 minutes and, not put them to sleep.
Yeah. Well, speaking of time constraints, we have reached ours on this show. Just real quick to recap, Dr. Blevins has a new podcast called The Old Ozarks, which you can find by searching Brooks Blevins, The Old Ozarks, wherever you find your podcasts. And thank you, Dr. Blevins, for joining us, and thank you, listeners, for joining us for Talking History. This has been a presentation of KSMU and the Missouri State University Department of History. You catch us the first Thursday at 12:06 after NPR News. This show is available along with our entire back catalog at ksmu.org or wherever podcasts are found. Thank you.